Brace yourselves, Africa, because the ground is shaking in Tanzania. And no, it's not an earthquake. It's something far deeper, more dangerous, and perhaps more hopeful. It's the roar of a soldier who's had enough of the lies, the hunger, the broken promises that have buried his nation in silence. On the morning of October 4th, 2025, a Tanzanian officer, Captain John Charles Tesher, looked straight into a camera and broke every rule of military obedience. His eyes were heavy, not with fear, but with conviction. He didn't speak like a man seeking fame or revenge. He spoke like a father, a son, a patriot who had seen too much rot to stay quiet any longer. What he said would shake the pillars of power. He accused the ruling elite of robbing the people blind, naming names that echo through the highest halls of Tanzania's government. He spoke of a deep state within the state, of elections rigged, of activists kidnapped, of villages stripped bare while ministers built mansions. And then he crossed a line no one had dared to cross. He called on the army, his own brothers in arms, to step in to stop the bleeding, to restore the nation's soul before it's too late. The result? A firestorm. Within hours, Tesher's video spread like wildfire across the continent. 5.7 million views, millions of comments, thousands of Africans whispering the same words. He said what we all feel. This wasn't just one soldier's outburst. It was a symptom of something bigger, a continental fever rising from the Sahel to the Swahili coast, where young Africans are no longer afraid to confront power. But here's the question we must face tonight. When truth becomes treason, what choice does a soldier or a citizen really have? Stay with me, because the story of Captain Tesher may not only define Tanzania's fate, it may reveal whether Africa's next revolution will come from the ballot or the barracks. Please share this video if you still believe courage can change a continent, and subscribe if you believe truth should never be silenced. It began not with a protest or a headline, but with a camera, a trembling voice, and a man in uniform who had run out of patience. On October 4th, 2025, Captain John Charles Tesher, a weapons instructor in the Tanzanian People's Defense Force (TPDF), set up his phone, pressed record, and stared straight into the abyss of his country's silence. What followed was a confession, a manifesto, and a declaration of war against corruption all in one. He began softly thanking God for giving him life and strength. But within seconds, his voice cracked with rage. "I am not afraid of anyone," he said. "Respect for my people will remain." That single line, simple, defiant, unguarded, became the heartbeat of his message. Tesher wasn't a politician, a preacher, or a rebel. He was the system's own child turning against its creators. He spoke of a deep state, not a myth, but a network of power rooted inside Tanzania's institutions, pulling the strings while the public suffered. He named names: former President Jakaya Kikwete, business tycoon Rostam Aziz, and even Abdul, the son of current President Samia Suluhu Hassan. He accused them of hijacking the country, siphoning billions from mining contracts, ports, and national industries, while schools in Arusha and hospitals in Morogoro went without chalk or bandages. Then came the unthinkable. Tesher declared that former President John Pombe Magufuli, who died in 2021, was not a victim of illness, but of an assassination. A hit, he said, orchestrated by the inner circle of the ruling Chama cha Mapinduzi CCM party. And he didn't stop there. He claimed insiders, including government official Humphrey Polepole, had leaked evidence of hit squads operating from Dodoma to Dubai. It was the kind of statement that could get a man executed before sunrise. But Tesher didn't flinch. He spoke of electoral fraud of the National Electoral Commission (NEC) that he said had rigged elections with the arrogance of colonial tax collectors. He accused NIDA, the National ID Authority, of weaponizing voter cards to silence opposition strongholds. To him, democracy had become a circus and citizens the clowns forced to applaud. He pleaded with the army, his own comrades, to step in before it was too late. "The only faith left for Tanzanians is their army," he said. "If the TPDF fails, Tanzania will fall." He quoted the Constitution, Article 18 for free speech, Article 39 for the right to vote, reminding soldiers that their oath was to the nation, not to politicians. And for the first time in decades, a Tanzanian soldier openly called for a military intervention, not to seize power, but to restore it to the people. It was a desperate, dangerous appeal. Take over very quickly, very quickly, very quickly. Those three words, repeated like a drumbeat, were enough to send tremors through every barrack and every ministry office, from Dar es Salaam to Mwanza. Within hours, Tesher's video spread across social media like a wildfire no censorship could contain. On YouTube, TikTok, and WhatsApp, his face appeared on millions of screens, unfiltered, unarmed, unafraid. By the end of the day, it had reached 5.7 million views, with hashtags like Mounds Captain Tesher and Mounds Save Tanzania trending across the continent. But what made his words so explosive wasn't just what he revealed, it was what they represented. In a country where dissent means disappearance, a man in uniform had spoken what millions whispered. He gave voice to the market women in Kariakou, to the miners in Gaeta, to the students in Dodoma, all of whom had seen their nation rot, while elites toasted champagne in Dubai. The TPDF command moved quickly. By October 5th, the army released a terse statement: "We follow the Constitution, not individuals." Tesher was officially disowned. But even as the system tried to erase him, his message had already taken root. In barracks and mess halls, soldiers murmured his words. On buses and beaches, citizens replayed his speech. To some, he was a traitor, to others, a savior. But to everyone who listened, he was something even more dangerous, proof that the wall of fear had cracked. And in that crack, the first light of rebellion had begun to shine. The silence didn't last long. Within hours of Captain Tesher's video going live, Tanzania's power structure began to shake. The ruling party, CCM, scrambled behind closed doors, its ministers whispering in panic, its media arms ordered to ignore the nonsense. But there was no ignoring it. The lion had roared, and his voice was echoing from Dar es Salaam to Dodoma, from the mountain villages of Mbeya to the fishing ports of Lake Tanganyika. At dawn on October 5th, the Tanzanian People's Defense Force TPDF released a chilling statement. "We follow the Constitution, not individuals." A simple sentence, but everyone knew what it meant. The army had disowned its own. Tesher, once a respected instructor, was now branded a traitor. His photos were removed from training centers. His colleagues were warned not to mention his name. And yet inside the barracks, the whispers grew louder. Soldiers who had once nodded silently during political speeches now clenched their fists. He said what we all know, one anonymous officer told an independent blog before his account vanished. For every statement of loyalty broadcast on state TV, there were 10 quiet conversations in dormitories and mess halls about what Tesher had risked and what it meant. Online, the fire was uncontrollable. Within 48 hours, Tesher's video surpassed 6 million views across platforms. The hashtag Captain Tesher trended not only in Tanzania but in Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, and Nigeria. Gen Z users remixed his words into songs and memes, calling him the lion who spoke. On TikTok, young Africans mouthed his quotes over music, tears in their eyes, fists raised. On WhatsApp, elders forwarded his message with captions like, "At last a soldier with courage." It wasn't just digital. In Arusha University, students gathered in dormitories to watch the video together, whispering in disbelief. In Tonga, fishermen played it on their radios between waves. In Morogoro Market, women passed around phones as if handling something sacred. For a brief moment, Tanzania's forgotten voices had found an echo, and it was wearing a military uniform. But the government's reaction was swift and ruthless. Security forces began rounding up suspected sympathizers. Bloggers disappeared. WhatsApp groups were shut down. The Tanzania Communications Regulatory Authority quietly throttled internet speeds in key urban areas. State television called Tesher a disgruntled soldier, while government-linked newspapers labeled him mentally unstable. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, usually calm and composed, appeared on television for the first time in weeks, smiling, talking about unity and peace. But the fear was visible behind the smiles. Everyone knew this wasn't about unity anymore. It was about control. And still the movement refused to die. In less than a week, 5 smaller protests erupted, not massive, but symbolic. Students in Dodoma marched with homemade signs, "Justice before peace." Vendors in Mwanza refused to pay local taxes for a day, calling it a Tesher strike. Artists painted murals of his silhouette on cracked walls. One arm raised the caption beneath, "He spoke for us." Then came the comparisons. Across African social media, Tesher's act was being measured against other moments of defiance. People invoked Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, Assimi Goïta of Mauritania of Niger. But Tesher was different. He hadn't taken power. He'd surrendered it, risking everything to demand the army save the people, not rule them. African commentators began to call it the East African Awakening. Kenyan activists drew parallels with their own Gen Z uprisings against corruption and police brutality. Ugandan dissidents said Tesher had spoken what we dare not tweet. From Cape Town to Cairo, Africa was watching and remembering that rebellion doesn't always start with guns. Sometimes it starts with a voice. Meanwhile, foreign analysts tried to downplay the situation. Western media outlets framed it as an isolated act of frustration, while regional experts warned of copycat coups. But on the ground, people weren't talking about coups. They were talking about conscience. Every night, Tesher's words replayed like a prayer. The only faith left for Tanzanians is their army. Take over very quickly. Very quickly. Very quickly. He was still in hiding, some said, in Mbeya, others in Iringa, protected by sympathetic soldiers. But his ghost was everywhere, in classrooms, in markets, in whispered prayers before sleep. By the second week, the world had moved on. But in Tanzania, something irreversible had happened. The people had tasted the truth, and once truth is spoken aloud, it cannot be unheard. And in that silence after the storm, a dangerous question began to echo across Africa's east coast. If one soldier's courage can ignite a nation, what happens when the rest of the army wakes up? When the smoke of outrage began to settle, Tanzania found itself staring at a mirror it could no longer look away from. Captain Tesher's defiance had done something no opposition leader, no foreign journalist, no election observer had managed in decades. It broke the illusion of control. The state was still standing, but the foundation had cracked. In the weeks that followed his broadcast, the country entered a strange calm, a silence that felt like the pause before thunder. Citizens weren't marching in the streets yet, but their conversations had changed. Taxi drivers, teachers, and farmers began using a new phrase, before Tesher, after Tesher. For the first time, ordinary Tanzanians were talking about the deep state in public markets and on crowded buses. Everyone knew what it meant. The same small circle of elites who had ruled since the days of Julius Nyerere, now exposed as the puppeteers of a nation built on borrowed promises. In Dar es Salaam, banners from the ruling party's billion-shilling re-election campaign hung over crumbling buildings. The contrast was unbearable. Flashy billboards promising prosperity, while clinics had no medicine schools, no chalk, and police officers begged for fuel. The hypocrisy had never looked so naked. Economic pressure tightened its grip. The Tanzanian shilling kept falling, food prices surged, and joblessness became a plague, especially among the young. According to 2024 data, over 30% of Tanzanian youth were unemployed. Many had lost faith not just in the government, but in democracy itself. As Tesher had warned, people are starving while the powerful trade their future for cash. His accusations now framed every conversation. When the government announced new mining contracts with Barrick Gold and port deals with DP World, Dubai citizens no longer celebrated foreign investment. They called it the auction of the Republic. Hashtags like Burkina Who Owns Tanzania began to trend, forcing ministers to issue defensive statements about partnerships, development, and trust. But no amount of press conferences could erase the image of Maasai families being forced from Ngorongoro to make way for safari resorts or students dropping out of universities that hadn't paid teachers in months. And while the political elite fought to contain the damage, the opposition began to stir. Leaders from Chadema, long silenced by arrests and intimidation, found new life in Tesher's defiance. Freeman Mbowe and Tundu Lissu, both victims of harassment and assassination attempts, began to speak again, cautiously through foreign press, but louder than before. They called Tesher a patriot, not a rebel. Inside Parliament, fear replaced arrogance. CCM lawmakers quietly deleted old social media posts praising the president's economic record. Cabinet members reportedly clashed behind closed doors over how to respond to the growing unrest. Some urged reform. Others whispered the word coup. Even within the TPDF, once the government's most loyal pillar, cracks began to appear. Young officers debated Tesher's words in canteens. Older veterans reminisced about Nyerere's ideals. Afrobarometer's data from 2020 showing that 60.9% of Tanzanians still trusted the army more than any political institution suddenly felt prophetic. Tesher hadn't just spoken as a soldier, he had spoken as the voice of that trust. The government responded the only way it knew how, through fear. Dozens of journalists were detained or threatened. Independent outlets like Jamie Forum faced new cyber lawsuits. A young activist from Mwanza who shared Tesher's speech was found dead in what police called a road accident. The message was clear: silence will be restored one way or another. But repression no longer worked like it used to. People had already seen too much, heard too much, felt too much. Every arrest, every lie, every cover-up now carried Tesher's shadow. His words had become part of the nation's bloodstream, a quiet rebellion pulsing through every conversation. And in that heartbeat, a new Tanzania was forming, one where fear still lingered, but faith was beginning to return, not in politicians, but in the people themselves. The shockwaves from Tanzania didn't stop at its borders. Within days of Captain Tesher's explosive video embassies across East Africa began filing emergency cables. The United States, the European Union, and the African Union all issued quiet but urgent briefings titled Tanzania Stability Watch. In Washington, the mood was cautious. The State Department called it an internal military issue, diplomatic language for don't rock the boat. Yet, behind closed doors, analysts in the Pentagon's Africa Command saw the warning signs. One leaked memo read, "If Tanzania follows the trajectory of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the U.S. influence in East Africa will suffer a serious blow." For decades, Tanzania had been seen as a model of stability, the calm counterweight to Kenya's unrest and Uganda's repression. But Tesher's video tore that illusion apart. American media outlets framed him as a rogue soldier, but viewers saw something else: a weary patriot, standing up to a machine of corruption. On social platforms, African Americans began sharing clips of his speech alongside footage of Thomas Sankara and Ibrahim Traoré, captioned, "Different country, same courage." European commentators were less sympathetic. French newspapers warned of the contagion of coups, recalling how the alliance of Sahel states AS led by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had already pushed France's influence out of West Africa. The Financial Times went further, calling Tesher's message a dangerous flirtation with populist militarism. Yet even those critical voices couldn't deny the deeper question the moment had exposed: why do African citizens trust soldiers more than civilians? Across Africa itself, the reactions were visceral. In Burkina Faso, youth groups held solidarity rallies waving both Tanzanian and Burkinabe flags. Traoré walked so Tesher could speak, one placard read. In Mali, radio hosts debated whether East Africa was finally catching up with the revolution of sovereignty. Even in Kenya, where protests had rocked Nairobi the year before, students called Tesher's act the voice of the people in uniform. But not everyone applauded. Some Pan-African intellectuals warned that the path of coups and military interventions could easily spiral into tyranny. The Nigerian columnist Chidi Onwuchekwa wrote, "A soldier who saves democracy today can destroy it tomorrow." What Africa needs is courage, yes, but also institutions that don't vanish with one bullet or one uniform. Still, others argued that Tesher's message wasn't a call for dictatorship, but for accountability, something that Western democracies often preach but rarely practice in Africa. The hypocrisy was glaring. For years, the West had funded Tanzanian administrations despite reports of election fraud, media censorship, and land grabs. Yet, the moment a soldier denounced it, they called him unstable. By late October, Western intelligence assessments concluded that Tanzania remained stable but volatile. In other words, they didn't understand what was really happening, because what was unfolding wasn't a coup. It was a shift in consciousness. For the first time, a country in East Africa was questioning whether democracy without dignity was democracy at all. And this question resonated far beyond Tanzania. In churches in Atlanta, mosques in Dakar, and cafes in Brussels, people debated the same thing: can Africa save its soul without repeating the mistakes of its colonizers? And hovering over all of it was one name: Ibrahim Traoré. His story had become the measuring stick for Africa's awakening. Burkina Faso had shown that sovereignty could be reclaimed, that development didn't require permission from Paris or Washington. Now, the world watched to see whether Tanzania would follow that same path or retreat into fear. In the end, the question wasn't whether Captain Tesher was right or wrong. It was whether Africa and the world had the courage to listen. History doesn't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes it begins with a whisper, a soldier alone in a room speaking truth to a camera. That's how Captain John Charles Tesher changed Tanzania. Not with a coup, not with a gun, but with courage. Yet courage is contagious and dangerous. Because once the people hear the truth, silence is no longer an option. Across Africa, Tesher's defiance is already echoing from the deserts of Mali to the savannas of Kenya, from the copper mines of Zambia to the goldfields of Burkina Faso. His voice joined a growing chorus led by men and women who've refused to be ruled by fear. But let's not romanticize it. Every act of resistance comes with a price. In Tanzania, journalists have vanished. Students have been arrested. The government still calls Tesher a traitor. And as we speak, no one knows where he is alive, hiding, or gone. His courage has lit a fuse, but it's the people who must decide whether it burns toward freedom or chaos. This is where the world, and especially the West, must pay attention. The same powers that preach democracy for decades now stand silent when African voices demand the real thing. And that hypocrisy is fueling the storm. Because this is no longer just Tanzania's story. It's a question to every nation that claims to stand for truth. What happens when the people stop believing in your version of freedom? The soldier has spoken. The world is listening. And Africa, restless, wounded, awakening, is deciding what comes next. So I ask you, the viewer, do you believe courage still matters in a world ruled by fear? Can soldiers like Tesher or leaders like Ibrahim Traoré truly save Africa's soul? If you believe truth should never be silenced, share this story. And if you believe Africa deserves better than corruption and fear, subscribe, because this is just the beginning of the dawn.